Today's video is brought to you by AG1 from Athletic Greens, the effortless daily habit that empowers your whole body's health. More on them later. Nazi Germany has been portrayed as so cartoonishly evil for so long now that it's difficult to imagine a time that they were taken seriously. But in 1941, the German army was considered one of the best in the world, victorious on all fronts, conquering vast swaths of territory with advanced strategies and tactics suited to modern warfare. One of the premier strategists of the German military was Erich von Manstein. Manstein saw better than most anyone else how the modern weapons and technology of the 20th century could be used to defeat the Third Reich's enemies, engineering plans that would inflict stinging defeats on Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, and catapult him to the highest echelons of the Wehrmacht. After the war was over, Manstein attempted to portray his actions as being patriotic, that he and his soldiers had nothing to do with the appalling crimes of the Nazis, that they were just as much victims as those who had died in the concentration camps. For many years, people believed him. But modern research and historical analysis reveals this to be a lie. The truth was, Manstein was emblematic of an officer caste who enabled the rise of Adolf Hitler, supported and encouraged his plans, and were more than happy to accept honors and privileges at his hand. Manstein would be loyal to the regime to the bitter end, even when Hitler himself had turned on him, and his post-war whitewashing of his involvement in some of the war's worst atrocities should be seen for what it is: a self-serving attempt to explain away why one of the most gifted commanders of his era allowed himself to fall under the sway of a deranged madman. Erich von Lewinsky was born in 1887 in Berlin, the son of a Prussian artillery general. Because the Lewinskys already had 9 children, and Helen von Lewinsky's sister Hedwig and her husband George von Manstein were unable to have children, Erich was adopted at birth by his aunt and uncle, a common practice at the time. His adoptive father was also a general, and another uncle, Paul von Hindenburg, would later attain the rank of field marshal during the First World War. In all, over 30 of his relatives were military officers, many of them reaching high rank, part of an aristocratic Prussian military tradition that dated back to the Middle Ages. It would have been frankly more surprising if Manstein had not grown up to become a soldier, considering the family business that he was born into, and so it seemed only the normal course of events that young Erich was commissioned as an officer in 1906 into the Imperial German Army of Kaiser Wilhelm II. He first saw action in the First World War, being wounded twice and rising to the rank of captain, but he could do nothing but stomach the humiliation of defeat at the hands of the Allies in 1918 alongside his comrades. With the monarchy abolished, the new Weimar Republic was restricted in the Treaty of Versailles to an army of 100,000, of which only 4,000 could be officers. Such was Captain Manstein's ability and family connections that he was chosen as one of the very few veterans to make the transition to the post-war Reichswehr. He was still there in 1933 when Adolf Hitler and the Nazis came to power, and like most of his fellow officers, Manstein supported Hitler because of his promises to remilitarize Germany and restore the glory of the nation, glory that had been stripped from them at the end of the war. Manstein and the German officers caste, many of them coming from Prussian noble families, were an inherently conservative bunch. They had prospered under the monarchy and were not fans of the democratization of the country. Above all, they feared a communist revolution like what had happened in Russia in 1917, seeing it as a great threat to the German, meaning their, way of life. Therefore, they saw Hitler as a way to return things to the way they were supposed to be. In turn, Hitler needed the army if he was to achieve his radical ambitions to make Germany the dominant European and world power. The Reichswehr rebranded in 1935 as the Wehrmacht and was declared by him to be one of the pillars of the new Third Reich alongside his National Socialist ideology. Today's video is brought to you by AG1 from Athletic Greens, a nutritional drink that completely changes your wellness routine like it changed mine. Look, I'm a busy person, and I need something that's quick and easy and covers all of my nutritional needs, and that's where AG1 comes in. It's made with 75 of the highest quality vitamins, minerals, and whole food source nutrients in the world. You can see them all on a big list on the back there. Plus, it combines 9 health products working together as one, replacing multivitamin, multimineral, pre- and probiotic, immunity support, and more. I've been taking AG1 for a while now. It's been probably a couple of years since they've been sponsoring me, and it's been a game changer. I typically have it in the morning with my coffee. It's the afternoon now, so I made myself up a second. All you have to do is you take 1 scoop, you put it in here, you shake it up, and you're good to go. It tastes great as well. It's very green, but it tastes vanilla-y, pineapple-y. It's tasty. And I have a special offer for you. All you need to do is head to athleticgreens.com/biographics or click the link in the description below, and you'll get a 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D3 and 5 travel packs as well, so you can stay healthy on the go. So don't wait any longer. Try AG1 from Athletic Greens today. There's a link below, and now back to today's video. The new regime was good for the military and for Erich von Manstein's career, as he went from a lieutenant colonel in 1933 to a lieutenant general in 1939. Every move Hitler made in those years, marching troops into the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the occupation of Czechoslovakia, was supported by Manstein, who believed this was nothing more than restoring Germany's historic boundaries. The same attitude existed towards Poland, believed to be an artificially created country that needed to be restored to German control. However, Great Britain and France, acting as guarantors of Poland's sovereignty, threatened war with Germany if they invaded their eastern neighbor. After the war ended, Manstein and other surviving generals would claim that they'd been forced into war by Hitler's order, that they had cautioned against invading Poland. However, the evidence shows that the Wehrmacht High Command had been preparing for Case White, as the occupation was codenamed since the spring of 1939, following the occupation of Czechoslovakia. The generals, Manstein included, were enthusiastic about war with Poland, predicting that the Western Allies were bluffing with their threats. The real threat, in their view, was the Soviet Union, which was neutralized in August by the announcement of a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin that included a secret agreement to divide the conquered Polish territory between them. What happened next is well known. Germany invaded Poland on September the 1st, starting World War II. 2 days later, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. It was now essential to finish the conquest of Poland before the Western Allies mobilized their armies, as most of Germany's generals believed that they didn't have the resources to fight a two-front war. To accomplish this, the Wehrmacht would turn to new theories of war, advocated by officers like Manstein and General Heinz Guderian. Mobile warfare differed from the way military campaigns had been conducted for centuries, which relied on the occupation of territory and strong points like fortresses to defeat the enemy, instead striving to defeat the enemy's armed forces through a war of maneuver. This would come to fruition in Poland through the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, in which the Wehrmacht rushed forward divisions of fast-moving tanks called panzers by the Germans, which were supported by wave upon wave of aerial bombing runs on enemy formations and cities. The Poles never stood a chance, especially not once the Soviets attacked them from behind, and the campaign was over in a month. Now the Nazis turned their attention to France, where the Allied armies were mobilizing. This was considered to be a much tougher fight than in Poland. Most of the generals were First World War veterans and remembered well the horrific fighting on the Western Front. The French had fortified their border with Germany with the Maginot Line, a series of strong fortifications that was considered impregnable. The Allies believed that the Germans would attack just as they did in the last war, by invading Belgium, so that is where they placed their best troops. Initially, the German war plans called for just that, with only one big dissenting voice, General Manstein. Manstein believed that he had a better idea: an attack through the heavily forested Ardennes region, believed to be by both sides impassable to tanks. By making the main thrust through the Ardennes, the Germans could then sweep up behind the bulk of the Allied armies in Belgium, trapping them in a pincer, which would inevitably lead to their destruction. The only problem was none of Manstein's immediate superiors liked this plan. The High Command of the Wehrmacht was filled with personalities that were all competing for the favor of the Führer, which usually necessitated stepping on each other. His bosses refused to forward Manstein's alternate plan to Hitler, and when he persisted, he arranged for him to be removed from his post as chief of staff to one of the attacking army groups in the west. But Manstein got the last laugh. On his way to his new assignment, he was given a private audience with Hitler and successfully convinced him of the merits of the Ardennes plan. Hitler ordered the plan to change, a decision that would have fateful consequences. The sickle-cut attack through the Ardennes took the Allies completely by surprise. Even the Germans were shocked by how successful their attack was. In a matter of weeks, the Germans had destroyed over 60 British and French divisions, with the loss of over 300,000 men killed or captured. The victory was not as complete as it could have been, however, thanks to a nervous Hitler calling for his panzers to halt for 2 days in order to resupply. The Allies were therefore able to organize the Miracle of Dunkirk, the successful evacuation of over 300,000 troops, including most of the British Expeditionary Force. No one seemed to care very much at the time, however. France would be forced to capitulate on the 25th of June and was put under German occupation. The humiliation of the First World War had been avenged, and though Hitler himself would claim credit for the victory, everyone in the Wehrmacht knew that the victory had been orchestrated by a general who wasn't even part of the attack: Erich von Manstein. Great Britain was now alone facing the Germans, but initial plans for invading the islands, called Operation Sea Lion, were shelved because of the superiority of the British Royal Navy and the inability of the German Luftwaffe to gain control of the skies over the English Channel. Instead, the eyes of the Germans turned to the country they believed was their real enemy all along: the Soviet Union. Hitler viewed conflict with Stalin as being inevitable, since the communist system was set up as the diametric opposite of the National Socialist one according to Nazi ideology. Thanks to propaganda and conspiracy theories, most Germans believed that the Red Revolution had been instigated by Jews as part of a plot to take over the world, and that unless they were dealt with, they would eventually spread their ideology to Germany and the rest of Europe. It wasn't just a question of ideology, though, but also of race. The Slavic people who lived in Poland and the USSR were considered Untermenschen by the Nazis, or subhumans who didn't deserve the land and natural resources that they had. The ultimate goal of the Nazi regime was to conquer vast tracts of land in Eastern Europe, known as Lebensraum, or living space, for the German Aryan race to populate, which would guarantee them a stable and successful future as the dominant country in Europe, if not the entire world. As for the people who already lived there, well, they'd have to be removed one way or another, unless they could be made to serve their new German masters. For the Nazis, war with the Russians was seen as a climactic clash of West versus East, the culmination of centuries of conflict, and had been planned as far back as 1939, prior to the invasion of Poland. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, when 3.8 million German and Allied troops invaded the Soviet Union, the largest invasion force in history. General Manstein, as the head of the invasion force, commanded a Panzer Corps in Army Group North, which was tasked with occupying the Baltic states before advancing on Leningrad, today St. Petersburg, Russia's second city. On September 12th, he was informed that he was promoted to command of the 11th Army, which was part of the Army Group South fighting in Ukraine. He arrived at his new command 5 days later, replacing General von Schobert, who'd been killed in a plane crash. 11th Army's task was to conquer the Crimean Peninsula, including the fortress of Sevastopol, which was considered to be one of the strongest in the world. The problem with the Crimean Peninsula was that it was so narrow, the kinds of wide-ranging flank assaults that Manstein specialized in just weren't possible. Instead, the series of bloody frontal assaults traded ground for the lives of his soldiers until he'd taken control of most of Crimea and put Sevastopol under siege. The Red Army counterattacked, making sea-based landings on the Kerch Peninsula in the east, able to hold off Manstein through superiority in numbers and by dominating the skies over the battlefield. The following spring, Manstein launched an offensive, the Battle of the Kerch Peninsula, that swept the Soviets off of Crimea, inflicting a massive defeat on them. Over 160,000 men were killed or captured, along with 250 tanks and over 1,000 artillery pieces. Manstein then turned back towards Sevastopol with air support from the Luftwaffe, as well as an intimidating array of artillery support. This included one of the largest guns ever built, the Schwere Gustav, a massive beast that weighed over 1,300 tons, with a barrel longer than the height of a 10-story building. It could fire an 800mm projectile at a target over 40 kilometers away, and was so big that railroad tracks had to be built in front of it in order to move it. By the 4th of July 1942, Sevastopol had been leveled by the artillery and bombing barrage, and the Germans had control of the city. In appreciation of his achievement, Hitler notified Manstein the same day that he was to be promoted to Field Marshal, the German army's highest rank. It was to prove the height of his military career. The war between the Germans and the Soviets on the Eastern Front, the largest military confrontation in history, was fought very differently from Germany's campaigns against the Western countries. Contemporary evidence indicates that most of the Wehrmacht soldiers believed the propaganda that their enemies were little better than animals. They were encouraged by their Russian superiors to treat Russian and Polish civilians savagely, and a blanket immunity from prosecution for all crimes against civilians was issued prior to the invasion. Training behind the army were SS death squads called Einsatzgruppen, who were tasked with murdering enemies of the state among the conquered civilian population and captured Red Army soldiers, including Jews, Muslims, political commissars, and members of the Communist Party infrastructure. Soviet prisoners of war were not treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, but instead deliberately penned up in inadequate prison camps, exposed to the elements and starved. It is estimated that over 2 million Soviet prisoners died in captivity in the first year of war, mostly from malnutrition and disease, as well as the brutality of their captors. After the war, Manstein and other generals would insist that they had known nothing about the atrocities and war crimes committed during the conflict. But this has been shown to be a lie. The Einsatzgruppen were ordered to work closely with the army units and issued regular reports of their activities. Manstein, like almost every other German general in the theater, knew exactly what was occurring behind the lines and either ignored it or encouraged it. The war began to go badly for the Germans in the last half of 1942 as the Soviets began marshalling their massive internal resources along with considerable material help from the United States and Great Britain. Russian generals were now also wise to the tactics of the Wehrmacht and were able to prevent the kind of open country flank attack that Manstein was famous for from hurting them anymore. The Germans, meanwhile, had advanced too far on too wide of a front and couldn't hold all the territory it had gained. Making things worse, Hitler began to assume more and more day-to-day control of the Wehrmacht's activities, and his amateurish decisions, such as his no-retreat order forbidding the yielding of a single inch of captured territory, even if the military situation demanded it, were starting to hurt. Field Marshal Manstein was transferred back to the Northern Front, leading a failed attempt to capture Leningrad, which had resisted a year-long siege by this point, and was also unable to reach the surrounded German 6th Army at Stalingrad, today Volgograd, which would eventually be forced to surrender in February 1943 with a loss of 300,000 men. Despite now being outnumbered by the Red Army, the Germans went on the offensive one more time in 1943, with Manstein attempting to flank a section of Soviet defenses in and around the city of Kursk. The Battle of Kursk was the largest tank battle in history, involving almost 10,000 armored vehicles, including the new German Tiger and Panther tanks. The Germans inflicted twice as many casualties as they sustained during the fighting, but the losses the Wehrmacht suffered could not be replaced, while the Soviets were mustering more and more soldiers to the front every day. Manstein and many of the other generals now privately realized that it was no longer possible to win the war against the Soviets. But no one could convince Hitler, who believed himself to be a military genius, to see reason. Manstein was one of the few that dared try, arguing unsuccessfully with the Führer several times to change his strategy and tactical deployments. All this did was make Hitler distrust the man he and most everyone else recognized as Germany's best strategist. Had Germany been led by a more rational man, it is likely that the Field Marshal would have been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the army, a post that Manstein openly coveted. But Hitler no longer trusted anyone's judgment but himself, preferring to surround himself with men that would follow his orders without question, no matter how insane. The end of Manstein's military career came on March 30th, 1944, when he was relieved of command in favor of Field Marshal Model. Despite his qualms about the way the war was being won, he remained loyal to Hitler to the bitter end, refusing to have any part of the conspiracy of officers led by Klaus von Stauffenberg to assassinate the Führer. He continued to arrogantly believe that Hitler wouldn't dare to leave a man with his military capabilities on the sidelines forever, and that eventually he'd be restored to command, with the Allies closing in on Berlin from all sides. But it was not to be. On May 7th, 1945, with Hitler dead and the German army surrendering, Manstein became a prisoner of British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. He would remain a British prisoner until 1953, being convicted of war crimes in a highly contentious 1949 trial, but he'd only serve a few years of his 18-year sentence before being let go. The reason for his early release was the looming Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union, as well as a myth started and maintained by Manstein. In Manstein's memoirs, published in 1955, he went into extensive detail on the war itself, criticizing Hitler's decisions as being the reason the war was lost, but was suspiciously mum on the racial and ideological politics behind the war in Russia, as well as the criminal actions taken during it. He had insisted during the Nuremberg trials that the Wehrmacht had behaved honorably during the war, that all the atrocities had been committed by the Nazis and their secret police. Because the Western Allies had experienced this honorable conduct when fighting the Germans themselves, they tended to believe the generals, since the ones arguing the loudest about war crimes in the East were the Soviets, who the West was growing to increasingly distrust. They tended to dismiss Soviet claims of massacres and brutality as being exaggerations or outright lies. The truth was, the West needed to rearm the half of Germany occupied by them after the war as part of NATO's defensive strategy against the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. They needed soldiers with experience to make up the newly constituted Bundeswehr, which would have to come from Wehrmacht veterans, including Manstein, who served as an advisor to the West German Chancellor in the 1950s on how best to rebuild Germany's army. So it was far easier to dismiss the outrages of World War II on a few insane leaders, almost completely ignoring the complicity with which the entire German army, and by extension the country itself, were complicit in wholesale slaughter and genocide. It would take decades for the extent of the Wehrmacht's participation in the war crimes of the Eastern Front to be acknowledged, mostly coming after the fall of communism and the reunification of Germany in 1990. Historical documents and reports show that Wehrmacht soldiers assisted the SS and secret police in conducting massacres of civilians and prisoners, as well as providing logistical support for the Einsatzgruppen to do their grisly work. They were also in charge of the Soviet prisoners of war and therefore responsible for their grievous treatment. It is believed that as many as 10 million Russian women were raped by German soldiers, and extensive historical analysis indicates that almost every German soldier on the Eastern Front participated in at least one criminal act. As for Erich von Manstein, he lived a largely quiet life in West Germany, dying in 1973 at the age of 85. He was buried with military honors, being described as a brilliant soldier who had been misled by a blind sense of duty. But this, like the clean Wehrmacht, is nothing more than a myth cultivated by Manstein himself. The truth is, the general was a brilliant soldier, but he was also ruthlessly ambitious and saw no problem with waging war on an unprecedented scale in order to secure his own advancement. He was perfectly happy to follow Hitler's orders for the most part, as long as the tributes and the rewards kept coming in. It was only after the war ended and he needed to talk his way out of trouble that he would blame everything on his old master, conveniently absolving himself of all responsibility in the process. In a way, Manstein's story is a tragic one, a tale of a brilliant man who allowed himself to be led into doing the devil's work in exchange for the fulfillment of his dreams, who probably didn't realize how deep it got in himself until it was too late to get out. But any tragedy is overshadowed by the fact that he never turned against Hitler, even when Hitler turned against him, and after the war, he cynically took advantage of Cold War tensions to get himself off the hot seat, going to his grave having never admitted to doing anything wrong. Which is why it is likely that history will forever remember Field Marshal Manstein as Hitler's general, whether it liked that or not.